In my conversation with Esther, she explained on how the displacement that we wanted to think through was in the observer, myself, as someone with a migration history. On that note, and before I begin the story of resettlement, I obviously want to take a minute to acknowledge and reflect on my position as an uninvited guest in the lands in which we gather today, the indigenous territory of the Jinyoung Nation. The architectural operation that we'll talk about today happened in Aswan, Egypt, and has also had a cruel impact and caused the displacement of indigenous Nubian population. It is not a subject, however, that I will treat today. It's something more of an ongoing research topic that I want to hopefully develop into a film. But I would still like to bring attention to how certain architectural enterprises and resettlements often have the worst repercussions on historical communities that inhabit those territories. Following this acknowledgement, I can kind of like flesh out my own trajectory and why I'm here today and what is this kind of trajectory of displacement. I was born in Madrid, in Spain, to a Brazilian mother and a Spanish father. When I was a child, my mother resettled in Egypt, and she's been kind of like coming and going ever since. So have I in a certain way, but I didn't move there until I was a teenager. When I was living in Egypt, I was living in Cairo, which is pretty much the beginning of just before the beginning of the Delta of the Nile, which is that kind of like very long green line that you see. That probably it's the river that needs no introduction. So when I was in Egypt, I was kind of when my whole photographic practice started. I was still a teenager, I hadn't gone to school, but I had this kind of like growing interest in photographing the story of certain temples that are located in Aswan in southern Egypt, kind of very close to the border with Sudan. It's a region that was previously, or where it's kind of historically known as Nubia. Before there was the kind of territorial separation between Egypt and Sudan, it was a nation with its people and its culture. What was interesting here is what is going on in these two images. On the left, what you see is an image from Frank Mason Good, photographer in the CCA collection, and one of the images that I discovered this summer when I visited the vaults with Esther. On the right is my own image of the Philae temple, quote-unquote the exact same spot, but the difference in between them is that although the space is the same, the infrastructure has been modified, and obviously it's a different time frame. The difference between the two is the largest archaeological rescue operation that has happened to date, undertaken by the UNESCO in between 1960 to 1980. In a way, the difference between these two images is that the place is the same, but the horizon is not. What I want to talk about today is more an understanding of photography, kind of similar to what some of the projects in the exhibition The Lives of the Document have, which is this idea that photographs can work as a sort of kind of conceptual exercises around the topic more than kind of like a fixed, definite artwork, like maybe a painting or a sculpture that is kind of finished at a certain point. So to me, in a way, what has driven my curiosity towards the Philae temple is of thinking through the temple or using a temple as a case study to think about what photography is and what is our relationship to documents today. Here you can see the temple in its context. The photograph is from the late 19th century. It's a wet collodion plate reproduced, also from the CCA collection, also from Frank Mason Good. As you can tell, the temple is surrounded by the Nile River. You can tell by the kind of flood lines on the rocks and on the edges of the temple that the Nile River is historically a river that goes through a cycle of flooding and kind of droughts throughout the year. That is what has enabled agriculture. So, since antiquity, this cycle is what has allowed food to be grown, but has also determined taxes, determined the public holidays, and in general used as an instrument or a reference point to regulate time, life, or in general, the rhythm of living. At the tail end of modernity, in the 1900s, the largest masonry dam in the world at the time, now known as the Aswan Low Dam, was completed. The dam was constructed to store water and support agricultural irrigation during the drier months of the year. In other words, the technical and architectural advancements allowed for suppressing nature and, most importantly, suppressing time. This dam also caused the water level to rise, especially during the winter months, rendering the table like this, basically flooded. The temple during these months was again flooded during half of the year and could only be visited from July to October. Moving the temple to the nearby islands of Bigge or Elephantine was deemed too impossible or too costly at the time. Each summer, the temple, when the water level slower. The temple was kind of like clean and restored following the plan of British geologist Henry George Lyons. In this process, the colored paints of the temple and all of the kind of vegetation, the bushes that were around the temple, as well as certain structures like the Christian village that was in the complex at the time, were lost. However, the final threat came when in the 1950s, archaeologists warned that the Temple of Isis, along with many other monuments, would be completely submerged after the construction of the Aswan High Dam. The main difference with the Aswan High Dam, it was a hydroelectric dam which created, or was going to create this kind of huge lake called Lake Nasr. And it was basically going to act as a reservoir, so they could keep the water level constant and they could generate electricity for the surrounding areas. It was also obviously a way to regulate, again, agriculture and make irrigation kind of more consistent throughout the entire year. After this considerably larger dam, the temple would sit in an intermediate buffer where the water level would switch very rapidly every day. This endangered the temple much more than when it was kind of submerged by the first dam, because the sort of back and forth of every single day, the changes in the water level were much more damaging to the temple structure. Several solutions were discussed. This is one of them. The first one was to straight up build a wall around the temple and kind of let it sit below the water level, but that would kind of obviously have a pretty significant impact on the landscape and on the kind of like visual aspect of the temple. Another option was dismantling the temple to the foundations and kind of elevating them and reshaping the island itself to accommodate the temple at a higher level. This was deemed impossible for structural reasons. Another option was kind of building 3 arc-shaped dams, which you can see here. So effectively kind of like making all of that area in blue, drying it out, and leaving the temple kind of like sitting there on its own. This was also pretty hard to execute because of the shape of the terrain and like underwater seepage. The last solution considered was to dismantle all the monuments in the complex and rebuild them in the same position on the nearby island of Agilkia, around 400 meters northwest of the temple. Agilkia at the time was not really an island, but a section of the kind of bigger area, which is on the, you can see it on the north, right in between the 2 smaller dams that are on the left. So basically what this brings up an architectural question, which is what makes the temple the temple? Like, where does the integrity of the temple lie? Is it in its foundations? Is it in its location, in its original structure? Is it on its landscape? Is it on the way we find it? Amongst this, there were several other questions. For example, when moving the temple, if it was to be moved, what things found in the temple were considered part of the temple and, let's say, meaningful of being moved, and what things were kind of debris or kind of traces left behind that were not part of the quote-unquote original structure. The temple, obviously, as most archaeological sites, is not something that is built at a specific point in time and kind of stays stable forever, but rather something that many different peoples have passed through and build kind of like supplementary buildings to it. In the end, the solution that was decided was to effectively move the temples. To do that, it was a 20-year enterprise which went through many different phases for different political reasons. There were many different countries involved. It was kind of championed by the UNESCO. There was, at certain points, problems obtaining hard cash and financing, which is kind of like a problem that still carries on to today. So it was funded by foreign governments and through the kind of like touristic exploitation of the images of the temple. So, for example, the UNESCO built kind of this world-famous exhibition of Tutankhamun in London to finance this process. Basically, as I was saying, there's 2 rings of steel filled with sand. They basically drained out all of the water in the area. I put this one in so you can see kind of how big a person is in scale to the ring. And you can see on the top right corner this kind of S-shaped pipe that was used to drain the water out of the temple. And there you go. The temple, and this is especially interesting for me, is in the process of kind of dismantling and moving it. it was obviously kind of like cartographed and sectioned, and so all the pieces could be identified through like a very kind of primitive system of what today we know as photogrammetry. So kind of mapping an object through the collection of multiple images, kind of like from every angle. In the meantime, the nearby island of Agilkia, or what now became an island, was needed to be reshaped to fit the exact kind of topology of the original terrain. They spent 5 years dynamiting everything and rebuilding the island up again. So in a way, even the territory that it now sits on is also it's basically a human construction. It's the built environment. Also, there was this this is an image of the island while it was preparing to kind of like be rebuilt again. And this is the last stone that was placed on the temple. While I was discussing this with Hester in the vaults, a really interesting or very poetic, I think, curiosity came up around the original location of the temple. The temple is the temple of Isis, or at least the kind of major building that's in the complex. It's speculated in this video that all of these images, sorry, I missed that. All of these images are from a film produced by the UNESCO, released in 1983, titled Rescued from the Nile. In this movie, the former keeper of Egyptian antiquities at the British Museum, Dr. Aidan Edwards, explains that probably the location of the temple was in the southeast corner of the island, so it would be close to the Tomb of Osiris, which is an archaeological site that was never found. To put it in context, Osiris is Isis' husband and brother, and is also kind of the deity that is related to fertility, to the Nile, and to its annual flood cycle. If the hypothesis of the Tomb of Osiris being in the southeast part of the island is true, that also means that probably that tomb was destroyed in the process of gathering rocks to build the dam, because that's where a lot of material was taken from to build the dam. So in a certain way, the tomb of the deity that kind of ruled this natural cycle was precisely what was used to build the dam to stop this from happening. I think it's like a very poetic association. This was not the only monument displaced. 22 other monuments, or 24, again, depending on what we understand as a temple, and hundreds of artifacts were relocated by the UNESCO, and some of them were gifted to the countries that helped fund the operation, or at least most significantly. This is why we can find, for example, the Temple of Dendur in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, but also the Temple of the Bod in Madrid, as is the case for other temples in Sudan, the Netherlands, Italy, and Germany. One of the most kind of renowned feats of that operation is the Abu Simbel temple, which is this temple that is kind of built into a mountain, which also had to be elevated around 60 meters above its original location. So when you're dealing with an object of this magnitude, you not only have to move the temple, but you also have to move the mountain. This is what it looks like today. This is actually when you arrive to visit it today, you actually arrive from the back of the mountain because the temple is facing the Nile and the road is kind of like behind it. What is especially interesting here, which is kind of premonitory of what I then started working on, were two things that I realized probably one of them is not very visible, but it's the installation of security cameras in the newly kind of built mountain, and also a commemorative plaque to kind of commemorate the opening or the ending of the rescue operation. There are two quotes that I think are particularly interesting here. The first one reads, "These monuments do not belong solely to the countries who hold them in trust. The whole world has the right to see them there." This is Dr. Vittorino Veronese, former Director General of the UNESCO, in their international appeal in 8th of March 1960. And the second one, "Through this restoration of the past, we have indeed helped to build the future of mankind." This is René Mahmoud, also Director of UNESCO, from his address to the meeting of the member states in Cairo, November 9th, 1963. Again, obviously, it's another moment where I think it's impossible not to talk about this, but all of this kind of like commemorative plaques completely, or make a complete omission of the displacement of the Nubian people from their traditional lands and water. This relocation of this population to a site far away from the waters of the Nile compromised their livelihood and survival. Only in 2014 did the Egyptian government officially recognize Nubians as an ethnic group and promise reparation and a return to their homeland. Years later, nothing has been done in this sense, and quite very much the opposite. We could argue that like the stealing of land has continued. Furthermore, these quotes kind of flesh out the main political transformations of the temple, which is, as Hester was saying when introducing the series, from a place of worship to a place of exploitation for the global tourist. This is the departure point of my interest in Philae and why I started photographing these temples. Again, here we're going back to the Mason Good image, one of my first images in 2017, and an image taken this summer in 2023. I'm not sure you can spot it through the projector, but even between the 2017 and 2023 image, one of them is kind of obvious, is the kind of like sentry house that is developed, which, again, you can't really see it here, but on a larger scale, you can read kind of all the branding from the Egyptian Tourism Police, and also the installation, can I point? Yes. Of a pole with security cameras right here. So although the Philae temple has been a popular destination since much before the construction of the dams, the rescue operation also allowed for kind of like an infrastructural and ideological alteration of the temple, incorporating necessary infrastructure to enhance the temple's capacity for touristic extraction. This is electrical transformers, toilets, emergency seats, emergency exits, lighting and PA system for light and music shows, but also security cameras, sentry boxes for police officers, and additional buildings for the new workforce required to operate the site. My photographic gesture here, in reality, is quite simple. I choose the point of view of a European tourist that arrives to the temple, but who chooses to focus in kind of like the architectural, or the newly born architectural wonders of the temple, which is all of this kind of modifications to make the temple more engaging or more attractive to the new tourists. The original structure of the temple becomes therefore a backdrop. The most important idea to consider here is the idea of the temple as a photograph with two main implications. The first one, it being a facsimile or a maquette. This is an object that we build to resemble another, which teaches us things that we didn't know when we started building it. The second one is kind of this photographic capacity to transpose a section of a moment and a place through time and space. In a way, the temple becomes this ultimate souvenir and kind of relates to this idea that kind of Walter Benjamin had of this kind of the quality of the hour in a photograph, of this very close remoteness, kind of. The temple, in a way, as you can see here, has always been itself a recording device. Before photographers, painters, writers, scholars, wealthy travelers, merchants arrived, and many of them kind of colonized the walls of the temple, writing their names just as to display kind of the feat of arriving in such a remote place. The temple is also a site that is politically sensitive to anything that is going on around it. So today it probably means security cameras and tourism police. In different times, it's mean the erasure of different icons of worship, or again, the signatures of travelers arriving in the temple. This is the view of the original site of the temple, like where would it have been before the dam was constructed today. I'm trying to argue here is that the temple is some sort of document in crisis. It's held in tension with the postcard, the selfie, the CCTV recording of the security camera, and the museum's archive. From another angle, we can also think about the temple as an object in motion or as an object in displacement, both as a photograph and as a structure. If we can think of the temple as an object in motion, we can start to think of acceleration, distances, and the traveling of bodies. As I hinted at the beginning of this presentation, I eventually returned to Spain to pursue my further education. When I arrived, I was obviously kind of thinking of this documentary work that I had been doing in Egyptian temples, and it took me a while actually to realize that I had an Egyptian temple probably less than 2 kilometers away from my university. This is the Temple of the Bod in downtown Madrid in Parque del Oeste. What was very interesting to me is that this temple was built with kind of like a pond around it to emulate its position in relationship to the Nile, and it was not accessible to the visitors for many years. I actually don't know if right now it's open or closed. What is especially interesting, and again thinking of logics of like surveillance and of how a temple or a site like this becomes a site of extraction and therefore it suddenly becomes sensitive to different dynamics, is that there was at night a security guard that would orbit the temple. The security guard could not leave because he was separated from me by the pond, but could also not enter because the temple was closed. So in a way, what I did was just sit in every corner of the temple and cartograph the guards' movement through a sequence of images. Again, in the construction of this new maquette, certain parts of the temple were also rendered inaccessible to the guard and at the time not illuminated. So this is, again, an exercise of cartography, kind of trying to map out all of the pylons, all of the entrance pylons that lead to the temple through the use of flash photography, which is kind of an intrinsic, something that is very intrinsic to the photographic document. Also, as the same thing happened with the Philae archaeological complex, since obviously all the flora and all the vegetation in the island was destroyed when it was dynamited, they had to kind of build this still in Madrid, but kind of replant or resimulate the original vegetation. So in Madrid, they added palm trees and other kind of non-autochthonous plants to kind of complete the experience. I follow the same exercise here using a flash that actually appears in the frame to document these images. In a way, because the temple, even though we can stand in it and we can walk around it, remains an image. It's this thing that is very close but very far. We have it right in front of us, but you can't access it and you can't touch it. So, and I'm going over time, so I'm gonna go a bit fast. This is a work that is actually the most recent. It's a picture that I had in the vitrine of Le Café au Petit Extra in the intersection of Ontario and Papineau this summer as part of Regard, an exhibition curated by Jacques Velavance and Chichen Wang. Here is an image on the left of it's my own picture of the Pompeii's Pillar in Alexandria, a Roman column which historically held the statue of the Emperor Diocletius. And on the right is another image from the CCA collection from Frank Mason Good. To kind of summarize brutally, what it makes it special, or what is regarded as a special thing from the Pompeii's Pillar, is that it's considered the only monument above sea level to still stand in its original location in Alexandria today. What I was trying to do here is to kind of allow the temple to have also look at us in Montreal and take an intercontinental trip for a couple of months and back. Finally, again, we find a very similar example. This is the kind of perimeter of the Dendur Temple in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It follows kind of the same pattern. There's the incorporation of lighting. Again, something that I find kind of very ironic when we think about it in the terms of a photographic document, and supplementary infrastructure to emulate the Nile, or in this case, to even emulate the difference in terrain. The reason why I started and I finished with this image is precisely because, in a way, I realized that when I was working through this project, I've never been closer to the southern Egyptian temples when I've lived in Madrid and in Montreal, where I was closer to them than when I was in Cairo. In a way, to me, the reason why this is interesting is because it poses a question for me of what is in movement, what is an axis of coordinates, what is the origin, who is the observer, and what is being displaced. This image, which I took with the help of my friend Luigi Iagulli in New York this year, is a self-portrait. You can see me, can I point? Yes, right there. Looking back among all the tourists that are taking a rest from a really exhausting day visiting New York and all of the antiquities found in the Met. That's it for me. Thank you very much.